A huge part of studying is memorizing. Even if you understand all the concepts, to do really well in the exam, you need to understand how to memorize effectively. If you think memorizing consists of just looking at a list over and over again until it sticks, you would be wrong. As you progress in your academic career, information becomes way more complex. So I'm going to give you 7 easy ways to memorize material no matter how complex it is. Because of course, this coincides with my slogan of studying smarter, not harder. Let's get into it. My name is Kumail Hussein. I am a content creator and a med student, just showing you what I know. And the first one is creating an image. Whatever you're trying to memorize, a fact, a word, or idea, try to create a strong image with what you're memorizing. Because when you create a mental image, you're more likely to remember. For example, Neil Armstrong was the first man on the moon. So you can think of a nail inside a muscular arm because that sounds like Neil Armstrong. This simple trick has explained why companies have made millions of dollars off selling cartoons. If you've ever seen Pixarized, Picmonic, or Sketchy, you know what I'm talking about. Not only do these brands use the idea of creating an image, but they also use the idea of a memory palace, which we'll talk about as one of the strategies later on in this video. The second one might be very familiar to you, and we call that acronyms or mnemonics. This memory device is extremely handy and is notoriously used by medical students. So one notable example is the mnemonic HOMES for the 5 Great Lakes. HOMES stands for Lake Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. Maybe you've heard of a thing called the Krebs cycle, where my science major's at. One of the mnemonics that I learned for the Krebs cycle is citrate is Krebs' special substrate for making oxaloacetate. So here we created a sentence out of all the substrates, and the first letter of each word is the first letter of each substrate. Obviously, in my example, the first word and the last word are the actual names of the substrate, so it really gets me oriented. There are other examples for the Krebs cycle, other mnemonics that science students use to memorize this, and they're kind of dirty, so I'm not going to say them here, but I will say the dirtier or more inappropriate the mnemonic that you create, the more likely it'll stick. Number 3 is relating it to what you know. When you're trying to learn something new and you're having trouble conceptualizing it or just memorizing it, try relating it to something you've learned in the past. Because these neural connections have already been established in your brain. So adding to these already present neural pathways in your brain makes it really easy to memorize and understand this concept. This technique can be used very broadly, and by thinking deeply, you can really find something to match it to what you've learned in the past. If you've ever taken a class called physics, one example is electricity. So say you're trying to learn the basic principles of electricity and it's just not making sense. You're trying to understand the basic terms of charge, current, voltage. So we're gonna relate it to the properties of water, which you already kind of know. You can think of charge as the amount of water in a tank. You can think of current as the flow of water. And obviously, the quicker the flow of water in this case, the quicker the electrical current. And the voltage can represent the water pressure. So this is an example of using what you know, which happens to be water, to learn a little bit about the complicated class that we call physics. The next step is teaching others. It only makes sense that if you've mastered a material, then you should be able to teach someone. So maybe you're memorizing a list of drugs and you want to kind of repeat back those drugs to a friend or colleague and explain why maybe these drugs are used and maybe something interesting about these drugs. Because when you're teaching it to someone, you gotta put it into your own words and you gotta make it sound interesting, right? So a person who doesn't even have that background can understand it. And this forces a little thing called active recall, especially when you're teaching someone and you're not looking at your notes. You're teaching someone from exactly what you know, so you're forced to retrieve the information from your brain and break it down into something simple. And not only does it make memorizing and learning way more fun when you're teaching to someone, but if you're having some difficulties teaching it to someone, that means you should go back and address that gap in your knowledge. And it's that time of the video where you need to smash that like button. And so the 5th one here is active recall. Now, you've been probably hearing a lot about this on either my social media, on other creators' social media, but active recall, or what they might call active retrieval, is science-based and really does help with memory. And a big thing that active recall kind of states is that instead of trying to passively review your notes or what you need to memorize, you are actively engaging in the material by testing yourself or quizzing yourself constantly in what you just learned. And even another way to do active recall is to write down everything that you just learned from memory without looking at your notes or the textbook. So some ways to active recall might include quizzing yourself, right? Asking questions as you're learning the material. Maybe when you're writing notes, you, instead of just writing basic statements in your notes, maybe you're looking at a lecture, you would want to turn those notes into questions. And this forces active recall as you're going through your notes. Another way might be if you're trying to memorize a concept or a topic, you look away from your notes, you look away from your textbook, and you try to write down everything that you know from memory. And that really helps with the encoding process. And another form of active recall, which I'm sure you are all aware of, is practice questions. Here's an example of how I use active recall in my life. So I'm sure some of you might be aware if you watch my Instagram story, I do modeling, I try to get onto TV shows, and I've auditioned for many TV shows. And the one difficult thing about getting on TV is to be able to memorize the script. So on one hand, I can passively review the script over and over again until I'm comfortable with it, but I've kind of developed a new approach using active recall, is I look at the script a couple times and then I just jump right into it. I look in the camera and I try to recite what I know, and if I mess up anywhere, I go back and review just that part, okay? And by the act of me engaging and quizzing myself and like almost being okay with failing and messing up on a script, I learn a lot better and I learn a lot quicker because active recall is a powerful learning method. Okay, and the sixth one is something called the method of loci, otherwise known as a memory palace. It's similar to like creating an image that we talked about earlier, and companies like Sketchy have made a lot of money off of it and have actually helped a lot of students. But you know, you don't have to find them on the internet. You can create them on your own and use places that are familiar to you, like your home, like your job, or the gym. Then we might assign meaning to each location and the items around you. And in the beginning, this might seem like a lot of work just to memorize something, but it actually pays off in the long run. Here's one I just made up for glycolysis, and I think you're gonna like this one. Glycolysis is a pathway in the human body that's the breakdown of glucose, right? Let's say I'm driving up to my house and I park on my driveway and I represent glucose. As I walk inside the house, I pick up a ball outside. This ball represents phosphate. Now I am able to enter the house because I am phosphorylated. From there, I take off my shoes, and that can represent an isomerization reaction, and I'm becoming fructose 6-phosphate, okay? And as I make my way to the room, I can come up with different things in the different locations in my house to represent the different reactions and the steps, which ultimately leads to me jumping into my bed. And by the time I'm jumping into my bed, I should be the final product of glycolysis, which is pyruvate. The seventh and final one is called chunking, otherwise known as grouping. So the last one is not as cool as the others, but is extremely effective because we know how the brain kind of works. So if you're given a lot of information at once, the brain doesn't really do really well. It actually gets overwhelmed. So what you kind of want to do is break it down and chunk it. The brain does much better when you can process the smaller parts of it. Like even therapists use this technique with their clients. A client might come in with a lot of problems that they're wishing to discuss. They have a lot of responsibilities and concerns and stresses, and the therapist just chunks it and breaks it down into smaller parts and kind of simplifies it for them so they can start doing one thing at a time and looking at the individual components of it. And a good rule to kind of follow is to break down things into groups of 3. 3 is a magic number. It's based on science, it's based on evidence, and it just works. So maybe you have a list of 21 organisms, bacteria, viruses, whatever. And what you do is you break it down into 7 categories, either based on structure, based on a gram staining, based on the size, based on where they're found, based on the symptoms, whatever it is. You take these 21 bugs and break it down into 7 big categories. And now, instead of memorizing 21 individual organisms, you're really just memorizing 7 big groups. And this drastically improves learning and memory. And get really creative with chunking, and you can even use a strategy to even manage your to-do list. If you ever had too many things to do in one day, break it down and pick the 3 most important things and get started there. And now that we've gotten to the end of the video, please hit the subscribe button if you like this content. It really does help me out more than you realize. Please check out my free course on Skillshare that's all about studying smarter. Bonus sections have been added to my course, and actually 2 new sections have been added based on memory techniques, which I have not discussed in this video. Just click the link in my description for a free trial of Skillshare so you can watch my course, plus thousands of other courses on Skillshare. And also consider subscribing to my newsletter because you will get a lots of stuff for free and a lot of valuable content and offers through there. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you here next time.